Hi, I'm Tony McMahon. I'm a TV historian, and I want to explain to you why I believe this man, Francis Tumblety, an Irish American, is the most likely person to have been Jack the Ripper. I'm so convinced, in fact, that I've even written a book about it, which you can buy online or from other retail outlets. But I believe that this extraordinary figure, this 19th century celebrity, and he was well known for other reasons which I'll detail, is the most likely person to have been Jack the Ripper. So hear me out, and then once you've heard my argument and my evidence as well, then I want you to tell me what you think. Have I constructed a compelling case that proves that Francis Tumblety, an Irish American, was in fact Jack the Ripper? I was actually invited to talk about Francis Tumblety on a documentary series on the History Channel, and it was in the course of researching Francis Tumblety that I began to discover some extraordinary things about this man. Firstly, that he was well known in his own lifetime as what we would now call a quack doctor, but he was a kind of celebrity doctor, and he was popularised by the growing media, the newspapers. In our own time, he would have been a TikTok sensation. Back in the 19th century, he was well known through the growing newspapers, the mass market newspapers, and he used every trick in the book to publicise his dubious medical cures. By the way, he had no medical qualifications to speak of, but there were lots of people like him hawking these dodgy medical cures across North America. He was born in Dublin, but like a lot of Irish people in the middle of the 19th century, he was forced to leave Ireland with his family as a boy because of the extreme poverty there. There'd been a famine, in fact, in Ireland, which forced many Irish people to sail across the Atlantic looking for a new life. I'm half Irish myself, and many of my relatives at my great-great-grandfather's level, many of his siblings, went to Scotland or the United States for a new life, and the Tumblety family were no exception. His family emigrated and ended up living in Rochester, New York State. But little did the family expect that the innocent cherubic boy in their midst, that their son would grow up to be one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. And what I also explain in the book is this extraordinary coincidence that this one man, Francis Tumblety, is arrested in 1888 as a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case in London. But 25 years before, he's also arrested as a suspect in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. The same man, Francis Tumblety, implicated in two of the greatest crimes of the 19th century. Now that sounds, I'll admit, a little bit fantastical. Do your own research and you'll find it's true. He was arrested in connection with the assassination of Lincoln in 1865. 25 years later, nearly, he's then arrested over the Jack the Ripper case. In 1865, he is in North America. In 1888, he's in the United Kingdom for reasons I'll explain. Now, of course, I know that there are all sorts of theories about Jack the Ripper being a member of the royal family, a Freemason, and so on, and various names that are often mentioned. I have to say that looking into all those suspects that are normally mentioned, either the methodology they used is completely different. In the case of the member of the royal family, he wasn't in Whitechapel or even London for part of that time when murders happened, but Tumblety is there throughout the relevant period. He also has a kind of pseudo-medical knowledge. That's kind of important because of the way in which the Ripper victims are killed. And I also believe that he had the motivation, and I'll explain why. What I should point out at this juncture is that in my research, and I went through newspapers from the 1840s right through to the early 1900s. Tumblety died at the start of the 20th century. What I found was that Tumblety had a string of criminal convictions. He was implicated in 2 manslaughters of his own patients, and in one case actually rode across the border from Canada to the United States to avoid conviction and stole the organs of the man who had died in order to remove evidence from the scene. He was also involved in fraud, he was involved in violent assault, and he was involved in a string of convictions and brushes with the law for indecency, gross indecency, because Tumblety, I believe, was a gay man. Now, that's another reason that many ripperologists have said, well, it can't be him. It couldn't be a gay man being Jack the Ripper. But I don't believe that those killings in Whitechapel were sexual in nature. I think they were to do with power, to do with sadism, to do with a kind of deep-seated frustration and basically psychosis. And as we know, anybody can be a serial killer, gay, straight, non-binary, whatever, and killing women is not something that is the sole preserve of heterosexual men, unfortunately. Now, as I said, Tumblety was something of a celebrity in North America. He wasn't known really in England or Europe, although he did travel around England and Europe. He claimed to be friends with Charles Dickens and the Emperor of France. The point about Tumblety is he's a liar, basically, but he's very typical of a lot of hucksters of the time in 19th century America. This was an unregulated country where anything went, and Tumblety set himself up as a doctor to the elite. He claimed he could cure everything from pimples to cancer, and he had a very striking way of publicising himself. He would dress up in a cavalry military uniform and ride down Main Street with an assistant dressed as a Native American handing out handbills for the business. And he was riding a circus horse, by the way, and with greyhounds on either side. I mean, it must have been quite a sight. He would then bombard the newspapers with paid-for advertising, saying basically, Dr. Tumblety, the Indian herb doctor, as he called himself, was in town and could cure anything. Now, he went from city to city because he was often hounded out of a city because of his nocturnal activities, trying to basically pick up young guys on the streets. And this, of course, was a time when homosexuality was illegal. And I show in the book that Tumblety was hounded by the police. He was hounded by the Pinkerton Detective Agency for decades. Billy Pinkerton, who was the son of the founder, seemed to have a particular interest in Tumblety and followed him all the way to London from the United States. But Tumblety basically runs this medical business. He sets up a pharmacy in each city where he's based, and he's based, by the way, in Canada as well as the United States. He doesn't seem to recognise the border at all. So he's in Montreal for a time, Toronto, St. John, and then he skips across the border to New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. So he's based in all kinds of places, and he always gets basically a room in a posh, swanky hotel so he can start hobnobbing with the rich. A lot of his publicity tactics really were borrowed from showmen like P.T. Barnum, who were contemporaries. You know, there's something of the circus performer about Tumblety. And as I said, there were plenty of people around at the same time who were fraudsters, who were hucksters, who were making extravagant claims, who dressed extravagantly like Tumblety as well. So he wasn't unique in that sense. He was just very good at it. He gets into major trouble in Montreal early in his career when he basically agrees to help induce an abortion. It's a woman who comes to the pharmacy asking for an abortion, and he basically sells her a kind of herbal remedy that will induce it. What he didn't realise was that the woman actually was a prostitute, and the man claiming to be her lover or husband was a police detective acting undercover. In other words, they were trying to frame Tumblety as an abortionist, and in fact, strictly speaking, abortion carried the death penalty, but very rare for people to be hanged for conducting abortions. But Tumblety, facing the prospect of a lengthy term in prison, fights this case and actually manages to win. I mean, it's astonishing actually on occasions how he manages to fight the law off in some pretty desperate situations. The reason I think he was successful in getting out of some very risky legal situations is he built networks. He had strong networks in the Irish community. He donated to trade union campaigns. I've shown evidence of that. And I think as well, it's logical to assume that he had a network of like-minded gentlemen who had to keep their sexuality a secret. As I mentioned, there's an astonishing manslaughter case in the Canadian city of St. John, where he's accused of having caused the death of a fireman. He never appears in court. He mounts a horse, rides for the border. The newspapers seem to think this is hilarious. I mean, they report it quite openly. Heads for Maine, and basically the authorities in Canada don't bother going after him. They don't chase after him. He actually steals the organs of this man from the mortuary in order to remove the evidence. But that case hangs over him for many years. But the way Tumblety deals with any potential bad publicity is he then writes all these paid-for letters and adverts in the newspapers saying he's been hounded by mainstream physicians who are trying to put him out of business because he's so good. He's shaming them. He's putting them to shame as a much better doctor. So he basically blitzes any negative publicity with propaganda, paid-for propaganda in the newspapers. When it came to women, everybody, and it's very clear that everybody knew that Tumblety's preference was for men. It's the language used in the newspapers, and I was a print journalist earlier in my life. It's actually hilarious to see the journalists inferring it very openly. They're even mentioning the areas where he likes to go cruising. He also has a string of problems with young men who he has obviously cruised. He's then presumably had sex with them. He then employs them in his pharmacy. Things go wrong. They steal from him. He then goes and complains to the police and the courts. The whole thing ends up in court. He's then accused by the young man, who then as it were, accuses him of gross indecency, of having basically sexually abused him, of unwanted advances and so on, and the case collapses. And this happens over and over and over again in Tumblety's life. He goes through this same cycle, hiring these pretty young guys. The whole thing goes sour. He ends up in court. They end up counter-accusing, and Tumblety never seems to learn his lesson. But it's his relationship with women that is very notable. He is, and this may be a result of his kind of very closeted life, him trying to suppress his sexuality, but his language about women is incredibly misogynistic. And intriguingly, he claims to have been married to a woman who he then discovered was a prostitute, and he then forswears from all women. Now, he writes this in an autobiography which he re-edits throughout his life, and you can actually still buy it on Amazon should you wish to. So you can see it in his own words that he claims that his first wife was a fallen woman. Whether or not this marriage ever happened, what it does evidence is that Tumblety has a deep-seated hatred of both women, and particularly of women who sell their bodies. What also emerges about his problems, his relationship with women, is that when people attend dinner parties at his apartments, at the end of the dinner party, they're taken into another room where they're shown a cabinet of curiosities. Tumblety opens up the cabinet of curiosities, and inside are several jars with preserved cervixes. And this is something that Scotland Yard discovers when they talk to their American counterparts after they arrest Tumblety as a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case. And of course, Scotland Yard immediately thinks, well, you know, 1-2 of the women killed by Jack the Ripper in London had their cervixes removed as part of this gruesome hacking into their bodies by Jack the Ripper. And of course, the moment they find out that Tumblety has a collection of cervixes, they think they've got their man. As I say, he runs into problems with the law all the way through his life, all the way up until the end. How does he never get convicted? The reason is, I believe, his networks that he has developed. And as I say, this includes in the Irish communities. He, in fact, almost becomes a politician for the Irish community in Canada. He nearly runs for Parliament. But I think that the abortion case stopped that, because after all, Catholics were not going to look, Irish Catholics were not going to look favourably on that. But he also he's always carrying huge amounts of cash and diamonds on his person. Every time the police arrest him, they remark on this. And I think he either bribes the police, or in a sense he lets them rob him, and that way he gets off, because they always know that every time they arrest Tumblety, they're going to have a payout. So let's talk about Tumblety's involvement in Abraham Lincoln's assassination. It's the end of the American Civil War. Tumblety has been making money in New York, in Washington, D.C. He claims to know Lincoln. He claims that he cured Lincoln's nephew of a sprained ankle. He's moving in the right circles. He knows people in the Union Army. He even manages to get a job at one stage as a surgeon in the Union forces, until General McClellan, who's the commander of the Union forces, actually kicks Tumblety out. And he kicks him out for distributing pornography, apparently, although in fairness to Tumblety, this may have been information on venereal diseases that was just a bit too explicit. Although earlier in his life, Tumblety did distribute pornography, so there may be some fact in that. But he basically has his pharmacy in Washington, and while he's there, he employs a guy called David Herold. Now, David Herold will be arrested as one of the conspirators involved in the assassination of Lincoln. And I also discovered that decades later, in 1914, at the eve of the First World War, so we're talking 40, 50 years after the end of the American Civil War, a retired police captain remarked that he often saw Francis Tumblety and John Wilkes Booth, the man who actually fired the gun at Lincoln, together. He saw them in Buffalo, hanging out together. So we have Tumblety knowing John Wilkes Booth. We have Tumblety employing one of Booth's accomplices, David Herold, and it's also said by the same captain that Tumblety knew Mary Surratt. Now, she ran a guest house where the conspirators met, and she was the only woman hanged in relation to the Lincoln assassination. David Herold was also hanged. John Wilkes Booth, of course, was killed in a shootout. So Tumblety is linked to 3 of those involved in the Lincoln assassination. So it's no surprise that Tumblety is then arrested. And by the way, remember, he is a celebrity doctor. This is like a celebrity TV doctor or online influencer being arrested, and it gets quite a lot of publicity. He's held in the old Capitol prison, which is on the site of what's now the US Supreme Court. He's held there for a while, but eventually released. He's also, by the way, accused of being involved in a plot to kill Lincoln and members of the Union Armed Forces by using blankets which have been infested with yellow fever. There was a belief that yellow fever could be transmitted through blankets and linen. We know now that's not true. It's transmitted through mosquitoes. But he was also implicated in that yellow fever plot. Now, he's cleared of involvement of that. He's cleared of involvement in Lincoln's assassination, but it damages his reputation. But being Francis Tumblety, he picks himself up. All these people he has known are killed. David Herold, John Wilkes Booth, Mary Surratt. He claims he never knew them. He claims he was never involved. He claims it's all smears. And off he goes to resume his medical career. So it's not hard to see why in 1888, when Tumblety, who's been hanging around in Whitechapel, he's a figure who can't be missed. He's quite a distinguished character, all big walrus moustache and dresses very flamboyantly. He's spotted in Whitechapel. He's actually taken in initially in connection with a case, with 4 cases of gross indecency with men. So he's up to his usual behaviour. But then when Scotland Yard confer with their American counterparts, all this stuff comes out about his previous conviction in relation to the Lincoln assassination, his repeat convictions for gross indecency in North America, his attitude to women, his collection of services. You know, the police in London think, my God, this is Jack the Ripper. Now, the thing that I find absolutely astonishing is that Tumblety pays enough basically to get bail. He avoids prison, and he then jumps bail. He basically gets onto a boat for France, and he then sails from France back to New York. And English detectives do follow him, and I found newspaper reports that prove that. He remained a person of interest. But there was a murder in Whitechapel subsequent to him leaving that I think threw the police off the trail. Now, that murder is no longer regarded as one of the canonical murders by Jack the Ripper. It may have been committed by Jack the Ripper, but it's not regarded as one of the canonical murders. So Tumblety was in London for those 5 murders. Now, it's interesting that when he gets back to New York, 3 things happen. One is that the newspapers take a look at his current valet, his current male companion, a guy who they dub Jack the Texan. Now, Jack the Texan is described as a rather sinister character who's accompanied Tumblety in London, and journalists wonder, could he have worked with Tumblety to have carried out the Ripper murders? Now, it's also very interesting that there had been a series of killings in Texas, the servant girl annihilator killings. Could Jack the Texan have been involved in those? And journalists speculate about that. But again, nothing comes of that. Then later on, we see Tumblety involved in a violent assault with a young male very late at night, small hours of the morning. Now, that goes to court. And unbelievably, the district attorney of New York takes time out from his busy schedule to come to court and to exonerate Tumblety. Why is the New York DA doing that? And I put it down to the networks that Tumblety has built. And the third thing that happens is that a prostitute, poor woman called Carrie Brown, is very brutally murdered in a Manhattan hotel. And this case is likened to Jack the Ripper, very obviously. Now, the case is pinned onto an Algerian guy who is subsequently cleared and released from prison years later. Unfortunately, the poor man has gone mad in the interim. But Tumblety is never taken in for questioning by the NYPD. Why is that? Again, I say networks. Now, I'm not going to deny it. I find Tumblety a fascinating, enigmatic, you could say roguish character, if it were not for the fact that he's obviously implicated in some appalling crimes, and his conduct throughout is pretty dreadful. He's a narcissist, he's a psychopath, he shows no consideration for other people. I also think he was syphilitic, and I present evidence for that in the book. Others have speculated on evidence found on his body in a hospital in St. Louis when he dies, 2 rings that they believe were connected to Annie Chapman, one of the Ripper's victims. That's somebody else's theory, but I do mention it in the book. And also a letter that it's believed to implicate, the little child letter, which is believed to implicate Tumblety and show that Scotland Yard took him very seriously as a suspect. That came to light in the 1990s. Retired police detective in England found that, and he has written about it. But I've included mention of the letter because I think it has some very interesting evidence that backs up what I'm saying in my book. So, if you want to get to grips with this, there's a lot of information. There's some amazing stories about Tumblety. It really does shed light on the whole period, the Gilded Age, Victorian London, the seedy side of the 19th century. A very interesting spotlight as well on the gay history of the 19th century. I urge you to read the book. You won't find it boring, I assure you. The pages zip by. I loved writing it. I hope that you'll enjoy reading it. So, read the book. Tell me what you think. If you don't agree, just tell me. I'm thick-skinned, but the more I looked at Tumblety, the more I thought there are questions to be answered here. So whether you're a Ripperologist or just an ordinary member of the public, give me your view. and thank you for watching. Look forward to hearing back from you.